theyeshiva.net.
Didn't Rashi teach his daughters Torah? Of course. The Rambam said, Roiv hanoshim, most. In other words, you have to understand who this woman is, who this girl is, what they need in order to be able to become the person they're capable of becoming. This is not a blanket statement excluding women from Torah, as I just explained. Reb Meir had a wife, Bruria, and the Gemara Chazal describe how she was an exceptional learner. Throughout all the generations, there were absolute exceptions, and some of them were extraordinary exceptions. We're not talking here about, again, a blanket statement. It's talking about appreciating who the girl is, who the woman is, and what she needs most in order to be able to live a fulfilled life. Let me add something. We don't believe in the concept that everybody has to copy everybody else just because somebody else is doing it. That's not how you work in life. You have to figure out what's really the best thing for this person. I know it's not politically correct to make any differences between women and men, but Judaism doesn't buy into that because there are differences, and not differences where one is better or one is worse, but just differences of character, differences of biology, you can't deny that, differences of disposition, differences of nature, different types of souls. So there's mitzvahs that relate to men, there's mitzvahs that relate to women, there's mitzvahs that relate to both of them, there's mitzvahs that relate exclusively to one gender more than the other. Here, it's not a blanket statement, black and white, but the Rambam says most women, at least in this time, this is what Torah Sheba'al Peh would do. There are other times where things are different. Today we know Sarah Schneer founded the Beis Yaakov school movement. Some were very opposed to it. What, you're teaching girls Torah? And yet most of the Gedolei Yisrael at the time, the Belzerov, the Gerer Rebbe, the Chafetz Chaim, Reb Chaim Moshe Grodzinski, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe Rayatz, Neshmasam Eid, and Schusam Yagan Aleinu, and many other Gedolei Yisrael embraced it enthusiastically because they realized in the early 1900s, Beis Yaakov was founded in Krakow in 1917 by Sarah Schneer. She went to the Belzerov, Rabbi Yisachar Doivre Keach Zechrona Levracha, and her brother thought that the Belzerov will, dissuade her from doing something so foolish and idle, and he actually blessed her with success. What was happening is the boys were going to yeshivas, and even many of the boys were lost to all of the modern systems and cultures and isms, but the girls were going to public schools, and many girls were just leaving Yiddishkeit. They were having an education. If the girls are home all day with the baba and the mama, learning Tzena and preparing for Shabbos and Yom Tov and weaving sweaters and taking care of the babies, fine. So the whole culture was that way. But the moment the girls were out there going to theater and going to school and going to exercise classes and learning culture and reading literature and becoming experts in many disciplines of wisdom and sciences and others, now when Judaism doesn't compete on that level, what do you have? You have sophisticated, educated women who are making a major impact on the world, but in terms of Jewishness, they're completely deprived of their Jewish heritage, their Jewish faith, and the indispensable contribution they will give to the Jewish world as future wives and mothers, who will build a new generation in a way that only moms can do and not dads, even stay-at-home dads, with all the respect to dads. So that's when they realized that Judaism, for women, has to become a very serious academic discipline, and everything changed, and all the Gedolei Yisrael understood this. Nobody's going to quote this Rambam and say, oh, see what the Rambam says, close all the girls' schools, even Torah Shabbat, don't teach Chumash. Nobody says that. And even the Hungarian rabbis who were then opposed to it, take the Satmar of Rabbi Yoel Zeichet Tzadik Levracha. He created a whole girls' system by Sruchel here, not here in Monsey, but here in New York, today also in Monsey, but here in New York, a whole girls' system, according to his understanding and his way. There were some disagreements, what they should learn, how they should learn, etc. Why? Why put them to school? His grandmother didn't go to school. The answer is because he realized we're living in a completely different generation. If you're not going to elevate and inspire the girls, you're not going to have a future to the Jewish people. So this is not a statement, a blanket statement that girls should not be learning Torah. On the contrary, it's a statement that you want to teach in a way that is applicable to the soul of the person. It shouldn't be misused. So you have to know what the girl needs, what the woman needs. The Rambam is describing most women. Why? Because that was the nature of most women, the way they were brought up in general society, whether we like it or we don't like it. Today, all Jewish sages, without exception, from all circles and all backgrounds, who will not divert one iota from Shulchan Aruch or Rambam or Mishnayos or Gemara, have changed the policy for good reasons. I hope this makes it a little clear. Next question. Somebody wrote here 14 comments on the Perek, which I read before the Shir. I think I addressed some of them to the best of my ability. I really, really appreciated your comments. Wonderful, wonderful remarks and questions and insights in the comment section on the yeshiva.net. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, thank you. I think I addressed most of your questions, no? I think a lot of your questions. Not all, but most of them. Beautiful questions, thank you. I didn't address one question, which is a big question. Why does the Rambam start these halachas with a ptur? And only in halacha A does he get to the chiyuv. The Rambam starts with Hilchos Talmud Torah. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt from Talmud Torah. That's how he starts off. Is that the way to start off the halacha? Like, why start off with those who don't have to do it? Hilchos Talmud Torah is about learning, so the Rambam should have started halacha ches. Every Jewish man is obligated to learn Torah. That's how he should have started. Or at least earlier where he says that just like you have a mitzvah to teach your son, you have a mitzvah to learn yourself, halachic dalet. But he starts off with everybody being those who are exempt from Torah. And then he says, but a child, he's exempt, but his father has to teach him Torah. It's a gewaldige question. If you look in Shulchan Aruch Harav, Hilchos Talmud Torah, you'll see the same structure. Very difficult to understand. Why would they start off Hilchos Talmud Torah this way? You would expect. Start off, it's a mitzvah on every single Jew to learn Torah. And then you can add, and there are those who are exempt from Torah. Gewaldige kasha. Bepashtus, the answer to this is because learning Torah is unique from all the other mitzvahs. All the other mitzvahs a child doesn't have to do. The rabbis obligated parents, fathers, to educate their children in other mitzvahs as well. Educate your child to bench, educate your child to put on tzitzis, educate your child to daven, educate your child to keep Shabbos, educate your child in all of the 630 mitzvahs, whatever we do. Age appropriate. Fine, even though he's not obligated till bar mitzvah. Torah is the only exception. The Torah commands the father, this is the only mitzvah from the 630 mitzvahs where there's a biblical obligation to teach it to your child even before bar mitzvah. No other mitzvah has that. You know that? Fascinating. In other words, when does the obligation of Talmud Torah begin in my life? Not when I'm 13, when I start talking. Torah tzivul ana Moshe. And even if that's midirabbanan, at least when you could educate me, you could teach me Torah. That's why the Rambam begins Hilchos Talmud Torah with a child's obligation to learn Torah, an obligation on his father. Because simply in age-wise, learning Torah that I have to do is a mitzvah when I'm an adult. But here there's a gewaldige novelty in Talmud Torah. The mitzvah begins when I'm a baby, or at least when I'm a young boy. That's a unique, only mitzvah that minat Torah, you're mechuyev as a child because my father is mechuyev to teach me. So that's why the Rambam actually begins with chronology. He begins with the earliest time when I learned Torah. When is that? Not as an adult, not when I'm a mitzvah, when I'm a child. So that's why he begins as a katan. Furthermore, if I didn't learn as a child, it's going to be very hard for me to learn myself as an adult. I'm going to have to learn, I'm going to have to find a teacher, I'm going to have to train myself. The ability for me to learn Torah myself is because I was taught Torah as a child. Again, there are exceptions, but that's generally how it works. So that's why the Rambam begins Hilchos Talmud Torah with the katan. The katan was mechuyev to learn. However, if he starts off right away that a child is mechuyev to learn Torah, then you would make an error. You would think that a child is obligated himself in Torah, and a child is not obligated. His father is obligated. So the Rambam first has to explain the exemption, that a katan himself is take exempt. However, his father is mechuyev to teach him. Now, once the Rambam is saying that a katan is exempt, as the system of the Rambam, he tries to include things together. So he already says everybody who's exempt, noshim, avodim, and ktanim are pater. But he right away says avol katan. Why say avol? Because I'm telling you, Taka, that they're exempt. But my main point is, but a katan is not really completely exempt because his father is obligated. You're typhus. And based on this, you can also explain that Tzemach Tzedek is sheyakir, that once he becomes a child and he recognizes the value of Torah, there's a chiyuv on him, because really there's a chiyuv on him even earlier, but it's not on him, it's on his father. But how does the father fulfill his obligation? Through the child learning. So it's not an obligation on the child, it's an obligation on the father. But what's the obligation? The obligation is that the child should learn Torah. So it's like an obligation on the father and the child together. So this is a very unique mitzvah, and that may be a source why the Rambam holds that kesheyakir, the child himself is mechuyev in Torah. There's another element I would add here, And that is, according to the Rambam, in his Minyan HaMitzvahs, in the beginning of Sefer Hayad, what's the source that you have to learn Torah yourself? The Rambam here brings Ulamadatem Oisam, Ushmartem La'asaisam, right? That's what the Rambam says, that you're mechuyev if your father didn't teach you. But the Rambam, in Sefer HaMitzvahs, and in the list of mitzvahs, in the beginning of Yad HaChazaka, and Sefer HaChinuch, you know what he brings? He brings the pasuk, V'shinantam levanecha. V'shinantam levanecha, according to the Rambam, includes two mitzvahs. One is to teach my children, and I see here also my students, and it's also the mitzvah to teach me, to learn myself. Chazal say, V'shinantam is sheyehei divrei Torah mechudadim, shnunim b'ficha. It's also a mitzvah, it says V'shinantam, not v'limadatem, that I have to master the Torah, so I should be able to really be an expert teacher. That means we see from here that the pasuk that tells me that I should learn myself is the same pasuk that tells me I should teach my child. In fact, the words are V'shinantam levanecha. And from there you learn the mitzvah that I should learn myself. At least it's one of the main psukim from which you learn the mitzvah that you have to learn. So if the main source of the obligation of Torah is from V'shinantam levanecha, teach my child, so the Rambam therefore starts off with the obligation to teach my child, because that's V'shinantam levanecha. That could be another reason, in addition to the first reason, that Limud HaTorah is unique, that it's the only mitzvah in HaTorah that begins when you're a child. And that's why the Rambam starts it that way, because it starts as a child, doesn't start as an adult. The question is, Hagufa Kasha. Why is it taka that mitzvahs, Talmud Torah is so different, that Limud HaTorah is connected to a child? And not only that, the obligation to learn Torah is learned from the pasuk V'shinantam levanecha. That's a great, great question. And I'm going to present to you very, very briefly a long, beautiful answer that we once heard from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He said this Shabbos V'eschan on Lamed Zayin, the summer of 77, and also Chavdalet Tevis Lamed Ches, 1978. It's printed in Likutei Sichos, volume 19, V'eschana. And very briefly, there's something unique about Torah which doesn't exist in all the mitzvahs. Every mitzvah is about an action to do or something to say, usually. Whether it's blowing shofar, whether it's reading the Megillah, whether it's benching, whether it's giving tzedakah, putting on tefillin. Torah is unique. What is Torah? Torah is a mitzvah on the person that I should actually take my mind and use my brain to understand Hashem's Torah. That's what Torah is. The mitzvah of Torah is essentially that a person uses his mind to comprehend Hashem's divine infinite wisdom. That's why the prerequisite of Torah is for a person to be completely humble. For me to realize that learning Torah is not about learning what I want to know in order to confirm what I believe, what we call bias confirmation. That's not learning Torah. Learning Torah is not that I should find a source that acquiesces and surrenders to my preconceived notions and conclusions and convictions. That's the antithesis of Torah. Torah is that I want my mind to be able to grasp and comprehend and become aware of the divine will and of the divine wisdom. And therefore, the first prerequisite for learning Torah is absolute humility. It's a thirst, it's a yearning to be able to know that there's something that transcends me and I want to understand it. This is true about all science and wisdom, but especially with Torah, because you're talking about infinite divine wisdom that is essentially transcendent. There's no way that a person with his or her limited faculties and intellectual cognitive abilities can grasp infinity unless there's an absolute humility and an openness to be able to understand whatever I can understand. And if a person doesn't do this, you could use the Torah for the wrong reasons. It's called Megala Pana B'Torah Shlei Kalacha. That's why Chazal say, Baruch B'Torah Tchila. You have to make a bracha before you learn. Before I learn, I have to say, Asher B'Charbanim V'Kalamim V'Nasan Lanu Es Torasi. I have to realize that it's divine wisdom that I need to humbly tune into. This is not only important before I start learning, it's also critical throughout the entire time that I learn. Because when I'm doing a mitzvah. Hashem said I should do something, I should do it. But Torah, I have to actually use my mind. I have to use my creativity. I have to use my individual way of thinking about things. Torah is all about your personality, your mind. It's really using your brains. You can't suppress your brains and just follow obediently and blindly. Torah is not learned blindly. You have to learn Torah and understand. And if you don't understand, you have to say, I don't understand. In other words, it's something that really requires human participation and involvement and creativity. And here, there is always the danger that my biases and my own desires and my own ego should actually blind and eclipse my ability to stay tuned to the truth of Torah, to the point that I become so convinced that I'm right, that if somebody argues with me, they're not arguing with me, they're arguing with Torah. In other words, my ego can take over and I can start thinking that every idea of mine is Torah, and if somebody disagrees with me, it's absolutely immoral, it's against the Torah, and the truth is, I'm being bothered because you disagreed with me. I'm being bothered because it's an egotistical issue. So therefore, whenever I learn, I have to always be permeated with the humility that it's never about me and me being right. It's always about the truth. I should never allow the bribery of an ego or any other form of bribery to eclipse my true dedication and commitment to Torah. And this, the Lubavitcher Rebbe explained, is the reason why we see that the mitzvah of Torah is the only mitzvah that Hashem tells us in the Torah begins not when you're adult. It actually begins when you're a child, and it begins the moment you start speaking. The moment you start speaking, you don't have very developed cognitive abilities, at least on a conscious level. You don't have the methodology and research and analytics and rigorous study and analysis. That happens later. What does a child have? A child has more than anything else the openness and the humility to absorb everything, which is why children absorb everything. They're like wet sponges. They take everything in and they remember it for life. That's why children remember things much better than adults, because it goes in and it penetrates. So the Torah says that Limud HaTorah is something that starts as a child. Why? Because this tells me that the beginning of Torah does not have to do with intellectual genius or maturity or development or creativity. The foundation, the beginning of Torah is the bittul. It's being a katan. It's like a child. A child is eager. A child is thirsty. A child doesn't do bias confirmation. You can feed a child everything. Unfortunately, you can indoctrinate a child. A child's brain is just open. That's the foundation of Torah. The foundation of Torah is as a katan, as an little baby, an infant who's just starting to talk and is learning about the world with this infinite curiosity and inquisitiveness. That's when you start learning Torah, because that's actually the foundation of Torah. Maktinas atzmai. And this bittul doesn't have to do with how brilliant you are, or how mature you are, or how old you are. It exists by every single Jew, even mamash, an infant, who can start talking, because he has a neshama, which is a chelik elekam imal, and is open to Torah. That's number one. Number two, the mitzvah of you learning yourself, you also learn from V'shinantam Levanecha. Because the Torah is saying, even when you're learning Torah, it has to be, I'm teaching a child. Always remain a child, even when you're learning. So the mitzvah for you learning yourself also comes from the mitzvah of V'shinantam Levanecha, teaching your child. The Rebbe then explained amazingly, a Mishneh in Pirkei Avos, Perek Daled Mishneh Chaf. Elisha ben Avuya says, somebody teaches Torah to a child, it's like ink written on fresh parchment. Teaching Torah to an old man is like ink on old parchment. It's erased. It's been erased many times, so it doesn't get absorbed. And they asked the obvious question, what's the Mishnah trying to say? I understand you're trying to encourage people to teach Torah to little children, but why deplete the enthusiasm of an elderly man who never learned Torah throughout his life, and now he wants to learn Torah as an older person, and what are you telling him? Oh, the paper, the parchment has already been erased, the ink is not going to be absorbed. Like, what's the point of the Mishnah? Why just, drain him from his energy? Okay, unfortunately, he didn't learn as a child, so encourage him. Like, why would the Mishnah put in the statement of Elisha ben Avuya? It's like, you're a lost case, forget about it. So, okay, I'll give up. I mean, is that what you're trying to do? Is that what the Pirkei Avos is trying to teach us? Encourage the positive, that people should learn when they're young. People should teach children when they're young. And Bechlal, what's even the Chiddush? Do you need a Mishnah to tell you that when you're young, you can absorb information much easier and much faster? You know how many languages children can learn when they're young? Now try learning 10 words in a new language when you're older. It's not going to happen. Our neuroplasticity, as they say, is just not the same when we're children and we're adults. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe explained that the Mishnah is saying something much deeper. It's not talking about age, it's talking about attitude. I could learn Torah as an old person and I could learn Torah as a child. Learning Torah as a child means I have the ability to be open, to be fresh. My paper, my parchment is fresh. I don't come into the shiur with my old toxic thoughts. I don't have to bring in my old paradigms that force me to take all the new information and reduce them and limit them to what I know. And if it doesn't fit in, I either shut down or I reject it. Learning Torah as a child means I always could be a child, even when I'm old, completely fresh. It's like I never knew anything. I'm completely open to absorb new ideas that may challenge me to the core. Because I'm ready for transformation, because I'm a child. That's why the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch Harav both begin Hilchos Talmud Torah with the mitzvah of teaching a child Torah. Number one, because halachically, that's when it starts. You start as a child. Unlike every other mitzvah, minat Torah, you don't start as a child, only midirabbanan. Number two, because the mitzvah of learning yourself comes from v'shinantam levanecha. And the explanation in all of this is because the foundation of Torah, the uniqueness of Torah is that you learn it as a child, because it's the openness to the bittul, the humility to Hashem, whose chachma it is, and even when you're learning, to always be that katan to some degree, in the sense that I have that freshness, that humility. I don't have to fit it in to my preconceived notion. I don't have to fit it into my squareness and to my box and to my old paradigms, but rather there's a freshness. I'm ready to really hear newness. I'm ready to be open to infinity, to Ein Sof. That's a brief insight of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in the opening of the Rambam. Why is banecha, vaydaitem levanecha, l'matem oisem as benechem, why is it sons, not daughters? Because it says benechem, a ben is a son, and a bas is a daughter. It could have said l'matem oisem as benoisechem, or benechem u benoisechem. So we see here that the mitzvah is only to teach your sons, not your daughters. So we have no mitzvah to teach the daughter. Why is there no mitzvah to teach the daughter? Because she's also not obligated to know. If she was obligated to know the Torah, there would be a mitzvah to educate her, just like there's a mitzvah to educate my sons. So Chazal also say, just like she's not mitzvah to learn, you're not mitzvah to teach her. And since she's not mitzvah to learn, and you're not mitzvah to teach her, she's also not commanded to teach somebody else. This is a Gemara Sugya in Kiddushin Chavtes. That's where the Rambam took it from. The Rambam says to learn and then get married. The man should learn Torah first before getting married. But Torah study is lifelong. Even after marriage, Torah study is always something one should do. So does it really matter if married first or married later? I understand what the Rambam is saying about learning Torah before marriage. No, obviously, there's a big mitzvah to get married and to start building a family. But the Rambam's point is that if the Yetzer Hara is not bothering the person, they can dedicate as much time as they can to learn Torah, and then they should get married. Of course, in every person that could be different. There are different customs and different communities, but that's the basic idea. But the moment you are not serene enough or spiritually focused enough or intellectually honest enough to really learn, then the Rambam says get married. How are we allowed to sell a sefer of Torah, which is Torah Sheba'al Peh? Well, the one who sells a sefer, he bought the sefer. So he bought the sefer. So you're saying he bought truth, but he's not allowed to sell truth. He's selling the book. He paid for the book and he has to make his parnasa. So what do you want? He should give away the book for free, so now he's going to lose money. He's not going to be able to sell anymore. And he won't be able to support his family. The Rambam believed that you shouldn't get money for teaching Torah, which is why the Rambam was first a diamond merchant and then he became a doctor. That's true. They say that Rashi also had a parnasa. Some say he was a winemaker. Without being judgmental, maybe it's okay today because we just can't do it any other way. So that's the justification for charging, and it became the status quo. Yeah, it's true. The Rambam certainly believed that the ideal situation is that every rabbi and every sage and every teacher and every rabbi and every judge should have a source of income and revenue without charging the students or the community. That's what he really believed. The Rambam believed this steadfastly. He didn't believe it changed. But many other rabbinic authorities, including the Kesef Mishneh, who discusses this, felt that under many circumstances that has to be changed. Many men still believe that women are second-class citizens. Why? Why do they believe so? I can't answer that question, but the same Gemara that speaks about teaching Torah Sheba'al Peh to women also says, Bini Yisera Nitna B'isha, etc., etc. Why are women not obligated to learn? A woman who doesn't learn would experience a huge void without that learning. I would get lost in Gashmis and not encourage my children to be frum. My aunts did not learn, they used their mind for law. My uncles were sent to learn in Poland. The children of my aunts who were not sent to learn raised children who were not religious. You're right. And that's why I explained that women are obligated to learn all the mitzvahs that relate to them. And women are obligated to learn anything of Yiddishkeit that relates to their life, which between you and me is plenty, an enormous amount. In some areas of Jewish literature, it's the majority of it. So in that sense, she is obligated. There's no obligation on the woman just to learn Torah in and of itself. In other words, the obligation on the man is to use every single moment and to know the whole Torah Shebeksav and the whole Torah Shebal Peh and the whole Talmud and never stop until he dies and use every moment for that. Yiddishkeit realized that the woman's primary contribution to the world and Jewish life is creating the tomorrow, creating families, creating children, raising them, creating a Jewish future and giving them their identity, their moral identity, their physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual identity. To tell a woman that you are obligated to take every single moment of the day and learn Torah, that the Torah feels would deprive a woman from giving her the empowerment and the ability to be able to fulfill what is her primary contribution to the world, which is continuing civilization and contributing and making sure that we have a healthy and vibrant future and Jewish tomorrow, which is the most important thing, obviously, because without that, there's absolutely no future. So the mother is the foundation of the house, the foundation of the marriage, the core of the family, and the one that guarantees the future of the Jewish people. Should a woman learn? Of course she should learn. If she's not inspired, if she doesn't know how to do her mitzvahs, she's not going to be able to do it. But as an independent mitzvah, just to learn, learning for the sake of learning and never stopping to learn and mastering more and more and using every moment for that, that's an obligation for the man and not for the woman, because the Torah recognizes that a woman's life is very, very different. There's a lot of emotion in a woman's life. There's a lot of attachment in a woman's life. A woman feels very, very responsible. A woman is really holding the foundations of the world, and you have to be very sensitive and respectful of that. Torah is oxygen for the soul. The father has to learn Torah before he can teach his son, because he's the transmitter of the Messiah and the chain from Hashem to Moshe, from generation to generation. If I don't learn Torah, I break the chain. That is like what the flight attendant says on an airplane. If the oxygen masks come out of the overhead, put your own mask on first, because if you try to save your young son before you save yourself, you're both going to die. That's why learning Torah is so important and why the father has to learn before he can teach the child. Torah is the same. Put your own mask on first, and then you can teach the child. That's how I understood the halacha in Rambam about learning yourself before you teach your child and before hiring a teacher to teach your child. Unless you see great success coming from your child, and then the priority should be your child, and you should just make times to learn by yourself. That's a very good example. Thank you very much for that clarification. According to the Ramchal in Maimer HaGeula, women are second class only in Galus. In Geula, the status of man and woman will be equal as was meant by Hashem. That's what the Ramchal explains. I would say it a little deeper. According to Kabbalah, actually, Nekeva to Seviv Gaver, when Mashiach comes, the Sheirish of Malchus will be revealed, and Malchus is higher than Zah. So actually the Maila of the Nekeva will be revealed over the Zachar. When you say second-class citizen, even in Golus, that's not true. It's not second-class citizen. It's a different type of Avodas Hashem. In the time of Mashiach, everything will be revealed as what it really is. So we'll see the absolute unity of women and men, each one fulfilling their unique contribution in their own indispensable way. But that certainly is a very interesting essay of the Ramchal, known as Maimer HaGeula. The fact is, do women today learn Torah Shebeksav and Torah? The fact is that in most girls' institutions, they have a rigorous curriculum of Torah Shebeksav, sometimes much harder than the boys, and many, many Jewish schools have a pretty intense curriculum of Torah Shebal Peh, including so many parts of Halacha and so many parts of Hashkafa, and this is done with the sanction and encouragement and enthusiastic blessings and often ideas of all of the Gedolei Yisrael, the great Torah sages, of literally all backgrounds within the Torah world, without any protest. Why? If somebody tries to reform halacha, they protest. Why don't they protest here? I explained this at length before. Because this is not about a black and white prohibition against women learning Torah at all. It's rather doing the right thing in order to make sure that our girls and our women are getting the oxygen that they need, just like our boys and men need to get the oxygen that they need in order to be able to live happy, fulfilled lives as human beings and as Jews, spiritually and also materially, because a life of Torah study is not just a successful life spiritually, it's also a successful life materially and psychologically and emotionally. Everybody have a beautiful day.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.